Welcome, Bronco Nation, to part two of my Boise State 2022 review series. We did part one talking about the offense with Ron Count. Today, we're looking at the defense. We have BJ Rains from Bronco Nation News. This is awesome to have BJ on the show. I'm a huge fan of everything that he's done. He's basically taken over the Boise State media in his presentation, Bronco Nation News. I mean, he puts out so much content on every Boise State athletic program. Obviously, football and basketball always going to be the highlights of Boise State. But I mean, anything that's going on with Boise State, he has something that he's putting out about it, and you're going to find content on his or news on his content sites there. So make sure you definitely follow him. I'm going to put links to all of his stuff today in the descriptions for the video. But it is fantastic to have BJ on. And then the last video in this series is going to be next week with Tyler Rousa looking at special teams. So we're going to look at the defense today. Like I said, got BJ Rains. Make sure you follow him on his Twitter, BJ Rains, and then also his Bronco Nation News Twitter at BNN Bronco Nation, and then obviously BroncoNationNews.com. And then as recent as this week, he has released an app, which is just kind of a link back to the website, but it's a nice, easy little bookmark there on your phone that you can click and go straight to all of his fantastic content. It's available in Apple stores and Google Play. Thank you so much for being on today, BJ. This is awesome.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you. I like the shirt you got there in the background, the BNN shirt. So appreciate that, man. Always been fun to get to know you the last couple of years. You're doing a great job with your videos as well. So let's have some fun, man. This should be fun.
And of course, the shirt I was able to get last time I was in Boise. I was there for the UT Martin game. Came on, did a little bit of a few minutes on his preview that he does.
Best rated show we ever had, man, was the one you came on. So there you go.
You guys had some great other guests on there, of course. Tyler Rousa, of course, was going to be doing the special teams as well. But I was happy to be a part of it and happy, of course, to get a little memento from the trip. So let's talk about the defense today. We're going to go through kind of 4-ish main categories. Again, this is kind of two discussions between two major Boise State fans. And we're kind of talking about the defense here 2022 and looking at what they did and kind of how maybe that translates into 2023. But we're going to go through a little quick summary, talk about some stats overall, some averages, in the passing game, the running game, how this team worked out overall. We'll talk about some storylines. There were some big storylines this year for the defense. Maybe not as big as the offensive storylines when you have a new offensive coordinator come in and your main quarterback, everybody leave like that. But there were still some big storylines that we'll talk about here for the defense. Then there's some top players. We're going to talk about some top players to defense as well. We'll talk about that recruiting class. We'll talk about Spencer Danielson's big raise. We'll talk about everything that has to do with 2022 defense on the show today. So make sure that you buckle in, stay to the end. It's going to be a great discussion. So starting off with the defensive summary, just looking at some quick statistics here right off the bat. Overall defense, they gave up 303.2 yards per game. That was actually pretty good overall. It was 8th overall in the FBS, 3rd out of a group of 5 teams. Their running yards per game, 132.2 yards per game. That was 35th overall. But their passing yards per game, that's where they really made the statistical mark, 170.9 yards passing per game. Now, however, there's kind of a big if with that because they also played a lot of teams that were run heavy or option focused like Air Force or teams that didn't necessarily have established quarterbacks. And you did see when Boise State played teams that had good quarterbacks and good wide receiver combos, there were definitely some weaknesses there. Oregon State put up over 250. BYU, that was a big one. Put up over 300, 377. Utah State with Cooper Legos, who I would not call an established quarterback, put up over 300. But in the Mountain West Championship game, and obviously it didn't go the way we wanted it to, when you look at the secondary's performance in that game, they held Jake Haener, who was the top quarterback in the Mountain West this year, #1 overall for the first-team offense for the Mountain West. They held him to 184 yards in that game and a 55.2 quarterback rating overall. Now, they did give up some yards against North Texas, but there were a lot of injuries, and that's a big storyline to talk about as well. Big injury bug this year. You had injuries across defense, from defensive line all the way through the secondary. I'm not going to name every single player because that's how many there were, but just some big headlines top. Washington, George Tarles, he was a big one. He's gone for pretty much the second half of the season. Tyreek Jones in and out a little bit, especially there at the end. JL Skinner, Kaniho, and then some other corners also suffered this year. They allowed young players to step up. That was a big storyline this year, getting to kind of see the future stepping up, the 2023 future. Jay Ladipo, Rodney Robinson, Gabe Hunter, Andrew Simpson, all getting playing time and all performing well in their playing time. Boise State struggled to apply consistent pressure. That was a storyline throughout the year. Some games were better than others. Overall, they ended up doing one better sack total than they did last year. 29 sacks overall in 2021, 30 sacks this year, but neither of those years are stellar sack total years for Boise State. But they weren't good at forcing turnovers. That, of course, was a trend from last season. But then this year, 15 turnovers, forced 2 more than last year, and 7 forced fumbles. So 22 turnovers overall. What stood out? I mean, that's a lot to throw right on the bat, right on your plate off the bat. But what kind of stood out to you overall when you looked at the defense this season?
Well, I was going to say you did your homework there, man. You pretty much covered it nicely. I don't know why you need me on, but no, I mean, I think that they obviously, as you mentioned, there are a lot of key storylines. For me, one was just some of the guys that stepped up. I mean, you mentioned some of the younger guys that got some playing time, and I was really impressed with how far they had to go down the depth chart, especially later in the season with some of those guys getting hurt. You mentioned Gabe Hunter. I mean, that dude's a walk-on, and you would never know it with the way that he played. I thought Ahmad Hassanin came in and played pretty well at times. Some of the other guys that you mentioned, Andrew Simpson, I thought did a great job at linebacker and came in and did some things. And so they had a lot of star power on the defense, obviously with Skinner and Tyreek Jones and some of these guys, but I thought it was some of the guys that people hadn't really heard of as much that also, stepped up. And I think you got to throw DJ Schramm in there. I know we're going to talk about him maybe more here in a little bit, but to have 110 tackles and do what he did, replacing, a key linebacker from last year, I thought he did a great job and was huge for them. So I think there's a lot of promising signs. You mentioned Rodney Robinson, Shale Depot, some of those guys. Alexander Tubner, I thought took a big step forward at safety and played really well, as well coming in at times for Skinner. I think he had like 11 tackles in the bowl game, right? So, I mean, they had a lot of guys that I thought stepped up and played pretty well. And I think we saw as the season went on, early in the season, we kind of found out this was going to be a defensive-oriented team, at least early in the season. We had all the offensive issues, and I know you covered it with Ron in terms of, switching quarterbacks and the OC transfer or leaving and all that. But it was a lot of grind the clock and run the ball and then, lean on your defense. And I thought the defense obviously played really well. And like you said, there were, a couple games, the BYU game, they obviously did not play very well, gave up, 531 yards in the BYU game. That was one that stands out to me, was a very winnable game. But you give up 531 yards, give up that touchdown, with 30 seconds left, something like that. I mean, that's one that's going to stick out to you. But as you said, against Fresno State, I mean, they gave up 245 yards or whatever it was. You got to win that game. So the defense played really well. I thought that, they again, had their hiccups. I think the Oregon State game, 470 yards wasn't great, but, the offense was just handing them the ball and wasn't doing a lot in that game either. So there was definitely a lot of positives, a few games or moments they'd like to have back. But I thought that, they're good players like Skinner and those guys played good. And I thought a lot of young guys stepped up as well. I mean, you mentioned the stats earlier. When you're, top 25 in a lot of key stats, points allowed and yards allowed and things like that, you're obviously doing something right. And, I know we're going to talk about Spencer Danielson, but certainly getting him to sign a new contract and come back, I think is huge because it looks like there's a lot of potential on this defense. But way more than the offense, there's a lot more questions about this defense that we're going to talk about going into next year as well.
Well, I mean, maybe some of those questions got some answers this year when you talk about those young players, when that depth being tested. There was a lot made about Taylor Green and his development and progression this year as a freshman. Looking at some of these guys, they don't have to be freshmen, but maybe some of those guys that weren't the starters at the beginning of the year or maybe weren't the primary guys throughout the year. Is there someone that stands out to you or a couple of players necessarily that stand out as someone that started off and maybe not a name you recognize who made major progression and now you think might be a key playmaker next year on this defense?
Well, there's a couple, and we kind of touched on, but I think Andrew Simpson coming in had 29 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, had a couple pass breakups. He even blocked a kick at one point. I mean, I thought Andrew Simpson really stepped up. And, now you're talking about trying to replace Zeke Noah, who moves on after his 6 years. And I know that, I think Andrew Simpson has a chance to come in at linebacker. I know he's, they kind of moved him around. He was at the edge a little bit. So, I mean, it kind of, we'll see exactly where he kind of fits. But I thought Andrew Simpson did a great job coming in. And I think Gabe Hunter was another one that we talked about. There was just so many injuries at that edge position and along the defensive line, as you talked about. I mean, they were about ready to see if you had any eligibility left to come in at D end. I mean, they were by the end of the season, just really hurting with guys that were hurt. And so I think that Gabe Hunter and Ahmed Hassanin both came in and played pretty well. I mean, when you look at the stats, they combined for 2.5 sacks, 3 tackles for loss, and 30 tackles between the two of them. So I think those are two guys, Hunter and Hassanin, that both, really stepped up on that defensive line. And, I mentioned, some of the other guys, Rodney Robinson, Shale Depot, those guys, that was kind of a storyline going into the season that they were moving Tyreek Jones from safety down to nickel. And part of that was because of how well they thought those two guys played at safety. And I thought that they both stepped up for the most part, Robinson and Oladipo, and played pretty well alongside J.L. Skinner there. So, I mean, I think there were some guys that took big steps forward with bigger roles. And now you're right. They're going to become even more prominent players moving forward here. But when you lose, by my count, I think 5, 6 starters on defense, they're going to have a lot of holes they got to fill. It kind of depends if you count George Tarlas as a starter or not, since he missed, half the season. But, Cortez Hogan's is another guy we didn't really talk much about. Cortez Hogan's came in, and we didn't really know much about him coming from Snow College. And he was injured the first part of the season, didn't play a whole lot. But by the end of the season, I thought he was a guy that you could count on as contributing. So, yeah, there were a lot of guys that we didn't know much about that really stepped up. And I think you're going to have that again with more guys here moving into 2023.
Well, in talking about guys that stepped up, but especially guys that maybe are moving on and how that impacts Boise State, looking at this defensive line, I mean, that's probably hit the most when you talk about players that are moving on. Obviously, that secondary is going to have issues as well. But the defensive line got hit by some transfers, some drafts, some guys that you knew were going to be moving on, some guys that you maybe didn't expect were going to be leaving. So Matlock, I think, we knew he was going. I'm pretty sure he's out of eligibility. But then Craven's transferring to BYU. A lot of people that kind of blindsided. Obacheri still had a year of eligibility left by my count because of the COVID year, but he's deciding to move on. So that's right there. Not that Obacheri was the starter the whole year, but you've got 3 major guys on that defensive line that are left. You mentioned Hassadine and his impact this year. How do you think that Boise State's D line is going to be impacted next year? I mean, is this going to be a unit that is maybe a weak spot, or do you think Boise State has the guys to step up? And I know we're kind of looking forward when we're doing this review, but these guys were big as part of that unit this year, and it was a strength for Boise State. How do you think that unit will look next year?
Yeah, and don't forget, Isaiah Banya transferred, halfway through the season as well. And they were just ravaged with injuries. I don't think Obacheri had any eligibility left. You can figure it out. It's kind of weird how you do that and look at it. And I'm right there with you, man. I don't know. It's so hard to tell on these guys, but I'm pretty sure that he was gone. Either way, he did send out kind of the, that he's moving on to the next level kind of tweet thing, but so did Zeke Noah, and he didn't have any eligibility left either. But you're right, man. Scott Matlock, I don't think anybody expected that. Cravens, I was a little surprised by that, to see him go to BYU, and actually Banya went to BYU too with the former coach from Boise State that's now there, and Kelly Papinga. So he took a couple of guys with him from Boise State. But you got Herbert Gums coming back. I think that'll be big, obviously, for Boise State on the interior. But yeah, when you're losing the quality of guys that you are, Scott Matlock is a huge. That's going to be a loss that you just can't easily replace. A guy that might get picked in the NFL draft. So it says it for itself. And just his leadership, he was a great leader. That's what I think they're going to miss more than anything, is just his leadership in the locker room and on the field, and just his determination. And that was a guy that you knew bled blue and was always going to give it all that he could for Boise State. And so I think he's going to be a tough guy to replace, no doubt about it, trying to replace Scott Matlock. They're going to have to and they already did, we'll talk about it, I guess, later or not, but, they hit the transfer portal pretty hard on the D-line. They added some guys that I think are probably going to, have to come in and step in and play right away. That's the nice thing now about the transfer portal, is you can see your holes and you don't have to project a year down the road. You can go get a guy that can play right away for you this year. And so that, I think, makes it a lot easier to plug holes. When you can, when you need a safety, okay, go get a transfer from Wisconsin. Okay, you need a D lineman, go get somebody from Boston College or wherever. It's pretty easy to nowadays in the transfer portal to plug those holes. And so I do think the D line, we're going to see some new faces step in. But I think Herbert Gums has a chance to take his game to the next level. He, for me, is a key player for this team moving forward. We've heard so much about him and his potential. And last year we finally saw it. We even saw him out there as the fullback on the Clydesdale package some on offense. So I think Herbert Gums is a key guy that's going to take over in the middle of the interior of the defensive line there. But, you're getting Dimitri Washington back. Unfortunately, he's just really struggled to stay healthy. Never really lived up to the potential to this point that we've, there was a couple of years ago, we're hearing about Dimitri Washington being the next Curtis Weaver, and it just hasn't happened yet, but he's coming back for another year. We'll see if he can get healthy and do that. I mentioned Cortez Hogan's on the end as well. I think they've got some pieces, but certainly from a depth standpoint, they're going to have to build that, in the spring and summer.
Well, that was kind of a storyline this year, was that there wasn't that Curtis Weaver, DeMarcus Lawrence, Leighton Vander Esch, whatever you want to say, presence necessarily coming from the outside, a guy in the backfield for Boise State. But that doesn't mean that there weren't defensive leaders or there weren't major statistics, stat holders here for Boise State. And obviously, the surprise leader was DJ Schramm stepping up, 108 tackles overall, number 1 on the team. Obviously, you had some other great players there that you knew were going to be great, like Jael Skinner, 62 tackles. Definitely picked up his coverage game, which I think was something that people looked at as not necessarily a weakness, but something that needed to be emphasized a little bit more. And I think he performed a lot better in that role. 4 passes defended, 4 interceptions, both of those number 1 on the team, and best of his career. So, and then you had linebacker Ezekiel Noah, Dimitri Washington, both tied for sacks, 4.5 sacks each. And then Noah had a forced fumble and also 2 picks. So when you look at this defense, and I'm not naming, there was a lot of other major contributors as well, some we've already talked about. Who steps out, as kind of your top defensive player of the year? And then how about Schramm, the rise of Schramm? I mean, maybe talk on both of those subjects.
Well, I think for Schramm, I mean, they were moving Isaiah Banya to linebacker in fall camp, and that was a big storyline because it was like, oh, they got to, they got to get a new starting linebacker here. Who's it going to be? And they had this kind of 3-way competition. They moved, they had Brandon Hawkins, and they didn't really, obviously think that he had a big chance to win it because they not only moved over Schramm, but to the outside the spot, but they also they, as I said, moved Isaiah Banya over there too, and for the weak side linebacker spot, the will linebacker, and I think they built a competition there, and DJ Schramm just fended everybody off and won the job, and he was maybe the surprise of the season for me defensively. I mean, to take a guy that had played some, done some things, but just to really not know what you're getting all of a sudden at this point in his career, 5th year senior, whatever, to come in with 110 tackles. I mean, that was just super impressive with what DJ Schramm did. I thought he was a guy that stepped up, really solidified things. And, when you think about what they lost at linebacker and him coming in and what he did, I mean, like I said, he had, I'm looking at the stats here, 31, I'm bad at math, 36 total tackles in his 3 years before. I mean, 36 total tackles. And then he comes in with, the stats are different here. The ESPN stats say 108. The PDF I'm looking at for the team says 110. So either way, over 100 tackles after having 24, 30 or whatever in the last 3 years combined. I thought DJ Schramm was awesome. And I wasn't sure if he was going to come back. I knew he had some sort of surgery he needed to have. He played banged up late in the season. But we just talked to him last week. He came limping out in crutches to do the interview. So he's going to miss spring ball. It's going to be a little bit of a, rehab process for him in the spring and summer. And I think that played into whether he wanted to do all that again and go through it. But he's back, and I think that's huge because we talked about it. But when you're losing Skinner and you're losing Jones and you're losing Matlock and Zeke Noah, I mean, some key senior leaders that have been, played in some big games for you for a long time, you need somebody like Schramm back. So I thought Schramm was huge, and I was really impressed with what he did. Looking at some of the other guys defensively, you can go down the line, but I know JL Skinner from a numbers standpoint maybe didn't have the numbers that he had the previous year in terms of the tackles and things, but I still thought he played very well. I think that he did a better job of trying to avoid the targeting hits for the most part. And I think that the guys in front of him made some more plays, which made him not have as many plays to make. But I thought he played great. I thought Zeke Noah played great, and in his career the way he did. He was a guy that I always enjoyed talking to. It was a great interview and was a really nice guy. And I'm sure he'll be around now with his brother still on the team for another year. But I thought Zeke Noah, as a 6th-year senior, again, there was a lot of pressure on him coming into the season. He was hurt, a little overweight, hurt previous years. Didn't kind of, at least last year, I didn't think played his best year in 2021. And going into last year, even Spencer Danielson said, we need Zeke Noah's best year of his career. He's got to be better this year. And I thought he stepped up and was, and, 3rd on the team, 59 tackles, 8.5 tackles for loss, as a middle linebacker. I thought Zeke Noah really stepped up and played well. And so those two guys at the linebacker spot, Schramm and Noah, I thought were rock solid. I thought that was huge. And then, I was disappointed to see George Tarlas get hurt because I really thought he was just coming on. He had 4 sacks, I think at the time was leading the team in sacks and was really finally starting to become a dominant player. He misses the last 7 games of the season or whatever it was. That was obviously very disappointing for him. But overall, I thought at corner, I think corner's an interesting spot because Tyreek LaBeouf and Keanoe Kaniho are kind of rotating at that other spot on the other side of Caleb Biggers. And that's obviously a spot looking to next year they're going to have to fill at corner, having to replace Caleb Biggers and Tyreek LaBeouf, it's, off the roster as well. So I think Kaniho did a pretty good job. He's a little bit undersized. They usually challenge that when I say something about that. They don't think he's super, but in terms of, he's obviously smaller than LaBeouf was. But I thought Kaniho, did pretty well, held his own for the most part. But I think that corner position is going to be another key one, as well as safety. We'll see if is Tubner take over as a starter? Do they move over either Robinson or Oladipo to the other safety spot? We'll have to see. They got to fill the nickel spot now too, with Tyreek Jones leaving. And I thought Tyreek Jones is another guy that we haven't really touched on, but he was a key senior sixth-year leader. He came back for his COVID year last year, and I thought made the most of that. And I know at times, battled injury there later in the season. Obviously was not able to go in the bowl game, which was disappointing, but 34 tackles for him, 4.5 tackles for loss. And he was, again, another one of those senior leaders. So for me, the leadership part is going to be a big thing going into next year, because you lose Scott Matlock, you lose Tyreek Jones, Zeke Noah, 3 of your better leaders on the entire team, not just on the defense. You throw in Skinner and some of the other guys, Caleb Biggers. You're losing some. There's a lot of losses. Spencer Danielson's going to earn his pay raise this year in 2023. So I'm excited to see what happens. But I thought, for the most part, their better players were their best players and stepped up. But for me, defensively, to make a long answer short, the biggest storyline was DJ Schramm, what he did. And I'm excited to see him coming back, how he builds off that here in 2023.
Well, and obviously there are a lot of losses across the board here that we're going to have to find a way to make up for, and maybe see some players in some different positions. I think we ended up seeing Oladipo there playing in the nickel spot with Tyreek Jones going down, which actually was what I was predicting would happen at the beginning before the season started. I thought that they were going to keep alignment with Skinner and Jones safety and then move Oladipo in at nickel. I loved seeing Tyreek Jones at nickel, hard hitter, give him a chance to go get some more tackles, get some more kind of penetration in the backfield in some cases as well. But I thought Oladipo performed well. But you're right, there is a lot of senior leadership that's leaving, but then also you have the super seniors choosing to come back. Obviously Washington, Schramm, Cortez Hogan's there. And then is Gums a super senior, or is he a 5th year? Is he
Gums, I think, is just a traditional senior. Yeah.
Traditional senior, but you still have some super seniors coming back and definitely adding their weight there to the roster. And it's going to be big on those guys to step up. And some of these guys aren't necessarily the ones that have been leading the way traditionally. Washington, like you said, he's been injured on and off. I think he has the potential, which has never been in doubt, to be the next guy for Boise State, but we've never seen him kind of do that because he's always struggled with injuries. DJ Schramm did that last year, stepping up to be the guy, but he's going to have to come back from an injury. That's not a role he's done traditionally either. And then Cortez Hogan's the transfer, who I thought looked great in some moments, also didn't play steadily throughout the year either. So you've got some guys that are going to be those super seniors that are going to be looked to for leadership, but also aren't necessarily traditionally the main guys. How does that play into a factor here as for them? With these, you kind of got concentrated factor here, a lot of youth, a lot of young guys on the roster, and you got these 3 guys that are maybe looked to as maybe main leaders on the team. How does that play a factor and a role here for Boise State?
Yeah, I think Schramm and Washington probably definitely are your, leaders on defense. Dimitri Washington already had his face on the banner outside the stadium last year. So, but I would think DJ Schramm's one of those guys this year that's probably going to be one of the 4 with his face up there and be potentially a team captain as well. I could see Washington getting it as well, one of the 2. But those guys are going to be leaned on a lot for leadership because, you're talking about, we mentioned it, but new starters along the defensive line, a new starter at linebacker, new starters in the secondary. You're going to have youth and new inexperienced guys kind of sprinkled in across the board here moving forward. And so you're going to need the leaders to step up. And I think that, like I said, Danielson coming back, I think is big. And we'll see, obviously, a couple of new coaches, obviously with Frank Miley leaving as well from defensive line. You lost the edge coach as well. So in Papinga. So, a couple new coaches on defense and it's going to be a new look defense with some new players, and it's going to be weird not looking out there and seeing Skinner and Tyreek Jones and Scott Matlock. We've been seeing those guys for a long, long time out there. And so some new players, some fresh faces, some new coaches. Defense is going to have a different look this year, but when you have Andy Avalos and Spencer Danielson both, leading the defense, I think you can expect that the track record shows some guys are going to step up.
We got to see a lot of guys step up on offense and defense that were new this year, and you kind of got to see the future of Boise State in the making, and that was exciting. And next year, you're going to see a roster that's maybe going through a little bit of a rebuild, but they are building for the future. And as part of building for that future has been finding funds, outside investments. Jeremiah Dickey's been doing an incredible job as athletic director. You can't say enough about the job that he's been doing to bring in funds for the program. Part of that is going towards actually paying coaches in a manner that will keep them building for the future versus maybe looking for some ways to expand their own paychecks at other schools. And part of that was a huge pay raise here for Spencer Danielson. You had Bush Hamdan coming in at $400,000, then they raised Spencer Danielson to $425,000, $135,000 raise from his previous salary of $290,000 and 290,000, some odd numbers after that. So that was a huge pay raise, obviously, for Spencer Danielson, and a big investment here. What does this speak to about where Boise State is as a program right now, what they're building to, where they're kind of throwing around numbers that aren't unheard of across college football, but for Boise State, and you talk about other things, that was a big reason why Brian Harsin left, but was the issue that this was kind of money wasn't being thrown around. Now it is. Boise State building for the future here, and kind of talk to that and what this means for the program and where we're going.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, you're right. It's chump change for some of these other programs, but for Boise State, they had never really paid more than like $350,000 for a coordinator. And then you see Bush Hamdan get the 400, and you're figuring that Spencer Danielson needs a raise, but I was thinking maybe they would just match him, with Bush Hamdan, but they put him on top, they gave him the extra 25,000. So to give, 400,000, 425, and I think it's 450 the year after that. So you're guaranteeing $875,000. And that's a big deal too, because up until about 4 or 5 years ago, they really didn't do a lot of multi-year contracts either. It was just kind of 1 year deals that they would just renew or give you a raise the following year. So to guarantee, 2 years and $825,000 for a coordinator is a big deal. And I mean, Spencer Danielson could have gone to Auburn with Brian Harsin, decided to stay to be the defensive coordinator at Boise State and get that raise. And I'm sure other schools have come after him. I believe Stanford was one of the many schools that was reaching out to him, here in the last month or whatever before he signed the new contract. So he was a very hot commodity, I think, in college football with what he had done. And so to get him to stay and for them to make the investment to up the salary pool, I mean, you're talking about $500,000 or more in terms of what Boise State is raising, I believe, in the salary pool, because you're given $100,000 plus raises for both your offensive and defensive coordinator positions. You have some other raises to coaches and guys they brought in making some money. Now you do lose a Mile and you lose, some guys that were making some money. Keith Bonifa, obviously, recent departure at wide receiver or at running backs coach, was going to make, I think $325,000. So, they're up in the salary pool, and I think keeping Spencer Danielson was huge because he's as I said, he's a rising star in the coaching business. I'm sure he's going to be a head coach somewhere at some point. And when Power 5, teams are trying to come get him, for them to be able to fend him off and keep him, I think is huge. And it sounds like Boise State, I think, is really playing towards this. They know the playoffs coming. The group of 5 is going to get a spot in the playoff here in a couple of years. They understand that there's no reason why they can't be that dominant group of 5 team. Even, I'm sure they'd love to get in the Big 12 or Pac-12, but if they can't do it, I think being kind of the cream of the crop in the group of 5 and potentially getting in the playoff every year is still, not a bad thing at all. And so talking to Jeremiah Dickey down at the bowl game, he just said, hey, we know this is coming. There's extra revenue from that. And we want to position ourselves to be ready for that. And I think they've kind of planned all along to with the budget and to raise some of these salaries and things to be ready for that. And they're in a nice spot. There's one more year. I'm disappointed. I wish we were going straight to the playoff 12 teams this year. Not sure why they have to wait a whole nother year. I know there's TV contracts and things they have to iron out, but I'm excited for when that comes. And I think Boise State, with some of the commitment it's making for its coaches, particularly with Spencer Danielson, I think is putting itself in a nice spot.
Well, there's definitely a new energy around this program, and you've kind of felt it shift halfway through the year there when you had Cutter come back in and there was a new movement in where the offense was going and the team, and you just felt a shift in the fan base. I know when I was at that UT Martin game, that wasn't a great energy there in the fan base, and they've definitely shifted and moved, and now there's this energy that it feels like it's back in the 2009 days. People feel like Boise State is going somewhere, that there's commitments being made by the coaching staff, by the athletic department, by the players. You got super seniors coming back on the offense and the defense that are building towards something. You've got a lot of experience, or not necessarily experience because there's a lot of youth, but a lot of skill on the youth side of things that are coming forward and be building for the future. So Boise State looks like it's moving in a very, very positive direction. Maybe not one that we expected they were going to start moving towards for a while, because we kind of tapered off there. Boise State, I would never say they declined, but there was definitely a point where it just seemed like they kind of plateaued. show. There was just this energy that it seemed like, we weren't the team being selected for the New Year's Six Bowls. We weren't necessarily that top group of 5 anymore. And it just kind of seemed like we were sinking away. And now it seems like Boise State's coming back. And part of those guys that are going to be building for the future is this new recruiting class. And we're not going to go too in depth. We've had a great discussion so far, and we do have quite a bit of time left if we want to, but we're not going to go too in depth into every single one of these players. But this was quite an impressive, I thought, recruiting class here as far as the guys they brought in, not just transfers, but the freshmen that they signed as well. Who are some guys that pop out to you? Some top defensive players from this recruiting class, from the early signing class, or from guys that have signed recently through the transfer portal? And do you see any of these guys coming in and competing right away for some of those position groups that we talked about that are losing some of these established starters?
Yeah, I mean, I think Wyatt Milkovic, a linebacker, was a guy that they really were happy to get. Max Stiege, the defensive lineman, has a really cool story coming over from Germany. I think they feel like he's got some size already for what he's coming in at, and he has a chance. Gabe Tahir, the cornerback from up in Washington, I know is a guy that they were happy to get. Another cornerback, Nick Hawthorne, Franklin Johnson, a DB that I got to interview down there at the bowl game from Little Elm, Texas, is a guy that I know is coming in with a lot of swagger and some potential. I think Michael Madry, defensive lineman out of Texas, there is another guy that they really like, and he's got a lot of size coming in. I mean, I think they feel really good about what they did in the high school class. But again, for me, it was some of the transfer portal ads they did. I mean, Kevon Wright, the edge from Boston College, he was a guy that was looking at Boise State out of high school, ends up going to Boston College. His final 2 were Fresno and Boise State. When he picks Boise State, I think that was a big get for them. Tyler Wegas, edge transfer from Utah, I think is big. Had 92 tackles, 10 and a half sacks as a senior in high school, was a highly touted guy and ended up going to Utah. Didn't get to play much, didn't really do much, but he's 6'6", 240, an edge rusher. And again, if you were good enough to go to Utah, then you're obviously good enough to come in and hopefully play at Boise State. So I thought getting him was 2 Power 5 transfers to help shore up that edge position, I think was huge. They added Sheldon Newton, a D-line transfer from Northern Arizona, which I also think, potentially is big. But for me, I thought getting Titus, the transfer from Wisconsin, they need to fill that secondary. Like we said, they got some, open spots there. And, what they did in the transfer portal, as I said, it's so easy now to just pick guys off and fill spots that you have. And when you're able to bring in Titus Toller, again, doesn't have a ton of stats, but had an interception as a freshman, I think, against Illinois. So you're talking about a guy that has proven it, has an interception in a Big Ten game, coming over and from St. John Bosco High School, very well-known high school. Boise State's got some guys on the team from there, including George Helani. So, I mean, they got some guys that, it's a track record. And again, I think he's a big guy to get as well, because you're not leaving Wisconsin to come to Boise State as a safety or a corner if you're not thinking you're going to have a good chance of playing. So they didn't promise him a starting spot, but I'm sure that the opportunity is going to be there for him. And I think, again, they had some needs, the secondary, the D-line, and they addressed both those in the transfer portal. And I think, and a lot of those guys, including Titus, are here for spring ball, which is big too. If you can get these guys in, I mean, that's why a guy like Ashton Genty had so much success as a freshman. He was able to come in, have the spring semester in the weight room, learn the playbook, have the 15 spring practices, and be ready to go. And I think getting a lot of these transfers in at mid-year is huge for Boise State to get these guys, in the system and ready to go for when fall camp starts in early August.
Well, I mean, that's a great breakdown of the players that Boise State's brought in. And I did a video that you guys can all find. I'll put the link in the description along with everything else, where most of the guys that BJ named, at least all the guys from the early signing class, went through all of them and threw in some highlight tape that all of them had on their Huddle or whatever sites they were putting their tape up there. So the good breakdown of all the players that are coming in for Boise State from the 2023 signing class. So make sure you go check that out. But yeah, big one, obviously, for me, kind of the highlight of the last few weeks was definitely Wright, the guy from Boston College coming in. I've got a friend who's a Boston College fan. He's telling me that he thinks that we've got a superstar here, someone who didn't necessarily find the right fit there at Boston College, but who in moments had some of those, you look at a guy who could be that next Curtis Weaver, DeMarcus Lawrence, whatever. This guy could potentially do that. And obviously, down between Fresno State and Boise State, I think that Wright made the right choice. He picked a school where his parents don't have to weave through the fights in the stands. So definitely a great one for him to pick to come here. But that's it. That wraps it up. This is a great review of the 2022 season for Boise State. We got to take a peek forward to 2023, which is what I wanted in this video. It was great thanks so much for coming on, BJ. Make sure all of you, I don't think I need to say it, but I am a massive fan of everything that BJ is doing there with Bronco Nation News. I mean, it's been one of the greatest developments of the last few years. Boise State related is just that source for all of your Boise State related news. He does videos, he does articles. It's all there. Highlights. I mean, his Lithia Ford post-game and pre-game show that he does is fantastic. Make sure you're catching up on all of those. So I'll put the links to everything that he does. Is going to be in the description. Make sure you go search it out. It doesn't take a hard Google search either to go find it yourself. So thanks so much for coming on, BJ. This was a great video. Make sure you guys like, subscribe as well. Got to put a little plug in myself for there at the end. Make sure you like and subscribe because we're going to have Tyler Rousa, former Boise State kicker, coming on to wrap this all up and talk about the Boise State special teams. That's going to be an exciting video as well. And then if you missed it, go back and watch the offensive review that I did with Ron Counts. Again, another great guy in the Boise State media community, writes for the Idaho Statesman there. So thank you so much, everybody, for sticking around to the end. I thought it was a great discussion. Thanks so much, of course, BJ, for coming on. And before I end with my traditional slogan, I'll just let you wrap up any final words you want to throw out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, with the team, I'll just say it. You mentioned it, 10 wins last year, and I think it's going to be exciting moving forward. Really tough schedule, obviously, having to start with Washington and having UCF and going to Memphis as well. I mean, one of the tougher non-con schedules they've probably ever had, and it's going to be a lot of anticipation for that season opener against Washington. And 9 starters back on offense with Green and Genty, and the surprise of getting Halani back and all the receivers. I mean, I think the offense has a chance to just be absolutely dynamic. I think more of the questions going into the season are on defense, like we just talked about for the last half an hour. And so I think they do have some questions on defense. But if some of these guys that step up, are ready for that next level, and if they can, find replacements for some of these guys they're losing, I think that, as you said, this has a chance to be a dynamic season for Boise State. I think they have a really good chance potentially if they can pick off a Memphis and a UCF and only lose 1 or 2 games to fight for that spot, which I believe is in the Fiesta Bowl in 2023 at the group of 5 spot before the playoff starts next year. So I think, I know a little people at times are a little disappointed with Andy Avalos and still haven't won a conference title in his 2 years, lost in the championship game, but to go from 7 wins the first year to 10 wins, to make the changes that he did early in the season and have it pay off, I think the program certainly appears to be on an upward trajectory, like you said, and a lot of excitement for the future. And I will just say personally, man, appreciate your support, and it's been fun getting to know you. And like I said at the beginning, you do a heck of a job as well on all of your YouTube and social media channels. So hopefully folks are, doing that and sponsoring you and buying your Bronco Bleymaier gear there. I like the shirt, but I know it's been, you do a great job, man. And that's what's cool about Boise State. It seems like there's a lot of very knowledgeable fans and guys like you that just want to do this, you're not getting paid for this. You're just a big BSU fan that's having fun and wanting to talk BSU football. And hopefully folks will continue to follow and support you as well, because you're a great asset for Boise State. And it's been fun to get to know you. And I appreciate the support. You've been a big supporter of mine. And it's been fun with Bronco Nation News. We'll see where it goes. And just hopefully folks will subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as yours. And I really do appreciate you having me on, man. It was fun.
Oh, that's one more thing I forgot to mention. He's got a YouTube channel as well. All the great site content, it goes on there as well. So make sure you connect. It's very great for interacting with those pre-game and post-game videos. You can go on there, use the YouTube app, and you can actually comment, and he'll pull your comments out and put them on the screen and talk about them. It's great. It's a great way to interact and actually have a discussion with. You're not just listening to a show. You're actually interacting and being part of it. So yes, also the YouTube channel, that is also a link in the description. I should have thrown up a photo real quick right now that you guys are seeing.
Man.
Make sure you guys go and follow that. So one last time, make sure you're following all of BJ's everything, all the Bronco Nation news, the Twitter, the YouTube, their news site, and downloading the app. And then make sure you like, subscribe as well. Thanks so much for watching, folks. Thanks so much for coming on, BJ. This is a great video. Thanks, everybody, for being part of this. And as always, go Big Blue!